We're glad you're here for this really important conversation. And I want to first express my thanks to those who have helped put this event together. Thank you most importantly to our speakers, to Beth and to Jennifer and to Marisa for offering your voice and your perspective to this day. Thank you to the Commission for Compassion, Peace, and Reconciliation, which is a very newly born arm of Trinity Church. And thanks to Henny Grossi for putting all of this together today. So why are we here? Why are we doing this? I've had several people ask me, why are we having this conversation? Well, our prayer book gives us a very clear answer as to why we are having this conversation. As the church, the prayer book says, our mission is to restore all people to unity with God and to each other through Christ. Restore all people to unity with God and with each other. It's interesting, isn't it? It just might be easier to be restored to unity with God than it is to be restored with each other. After all, God in the physical world, or our world, is unseeable, untouchable. While visible, God is still invisible. The truth from above, burning bushes and mountaintops, the stuff of Charlton Heston movies. In our Christian imagination, it's fairly easy to relate to God. God looks just like us, right? Insert sarcasm emoji. Being restored to unity with each other, that's the hard one. Whereas we cannot see God's skin color, God's physicality, or the way God is dressed, we can see those things about each other. We are able to make determinations about each other because we can see each other, have a history with each other. And of course, we are all experts on each other. Insert sarcasm emoji. We are here today because this work of being reconciled with God and with each other is the church's work. We are here because we are absolutely not authorities on each other, and we have an opportunity to learn. We are here because it's time to bring this conversation about how we treat each other into the light and into the life of the church. Now, some of you may not know me well, but I grew up in the land of veiled conversations. We skirted around important topics. We danced around important subjects. We talked indirectly about things and not directly to people. As a gay man who grew up among genteel women and men, I learned quickly how to talk about anything other than the thing we needed to talk about. I never benefited from these conversations, nor did the church. So I try very hard not to operate this way anymore. It's important to me that each of us, individually and as the body of Christ, be able to identify and name the things that we need to address. There are many things that need our attention, but for today, we turn our attention to race, gender, privilege, and the desire for all of God's children to flourish. These are the things that need to be named and explored. In the Episcopal Church, it's no secret that we are largely wealthy, white, and our leadership is predominantly male. And I think that an open, honest, loving exploration of why this is the case can be a model for the rest of society. I truly believe it is possible to be awesome and self-critical. That's how I see the Episcopal Church. We are here not because of politics, but because we believe in and follow a Jesus who calls us to look closely at ourselves, to put things into the light. And today we put the topics of race, privilege, and the church into the light. Why not keep them hidden, veiled? Because if we're ever going to be restored to each other, every single individual has to be given the space to name the way that we heal and the ways that we hurt, and to make changes. So today is not about pointing fingers. Today is about being curious. It's about wondering. It's about how we, the church, can be more reflective of the image of God. We are made in the image of God. And the image of God that I carry around isn't a God with skin color or hair color or body type or gender. The image of God I carry is a God who is most real in togetherness. A God who has texture and whose language is mystery and wonder. So thank you for being here today to name what is important. Thank you for being brave enough to be excited and brave enough to be uncomfortable. May our conversation today be grounded in curiosity and in hope. And may our conversation help us know each other in life-giving ways. And may our work and our words this day bring us closer to the heartbeat of Jesus, the crucified and risen Savior of us all. Will you pray with me? Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatreds cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Henny.
Thank you, Charlie. I recently was skimming through Thomas Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, published in 2016. And in that book, he quotes a song by Brandi Carlile. And the refrain of the name of the song is The I, spelled E-Y-E. And the refrain of the song is, I wrapped your love around me like a chain, but I never was afraid that it would die. You can only dance in a hurricane. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you are standing in the eye. You can dance in a hurricane, but only if you are standing in the eye. And Friedman likens the times we're living in to those of a hurricane. He says the only way to thrive in these times is by finding or creating our own eye of the hurricane. And he says the closest political analogy he finds for the eye of a hurricane is a healthy community, a place where people feel protected, respected, and connected. Protected, respected, and connected. And I think those three things are things that we here at Trinity would like Trinity Church to be. We want Trinity Church to be the eye of the hurricane. And this means that this is a safe place, that people can speak their minds, knowing that they will be listened to and heard. We remember the old adage that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Some of our time today will be spent in table conversations or dyads or triads. We'll probably hear things we don't agree with. We may say things that others don't agree with. But as Bishop Kate reminds us, Jesus did not command us to agree with each other. He commanded us to love each other. So if we can speak with care and compassion in our hearts, and if we can equally hear with care and compassion, our conversations today will witness to our baptismal promise to respect the dignity of every human being. One of the things that kept me here at Trinity for now 4.5 years is the health of this faith community, the healthy relationships that we have with each other. In 25 years of ordained ministry, this is the healthiest parish I've been in. We do not gossip. We do not talk about each other behind our backs. We talk to each other and with each other, and we do it with care and compassion and respect. We're not here today to induce guilt. As Charlie said, we're not here to point fingers. We're here to look at things in a systemic and from an institutional perspective. And I pray that it will lead us to ways in which we can truly respect the dignity and freedom, the dignity of every human being. Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Jennifer Baskerville-Burrows. In case you haven't heard, she's going to be our new bishop. And all I can say is we're really excited about that, and we're excited for you to be here today. Jennifer, welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody. It is something to get up early to come to a conversation like this. And so I want to thank you for making the time, dedicating your day. And I suspect for some of you that this is just one of an ongoing series of conversations on these topics. And so I hope you'll sort of find your way in the flow as we have this conversation. And for others, there may be some new things. Maybe this is the first time you're sort of diving in this way. And so wherever you are on that spectrum, welcome. I'm glad that you are stepping boldly into this space. I have to say, it's kind of an interesting thing. This is I've been preaching around the diocese a lot over the last 2 months. And this is the first kind of public forum I've had since arriving in Indiana. And so the topic, is interesting to me, not only because it's a topic I'm passionate about, but what it does, I think, for you and I, for those of you who are part of the Episcopal Church, this conversation is beginning our relationship in a way that's going to take us deep rather quickly. We are still meeting one another and getting to know one another. And so there is, I will just have to note a little bit, there's a lot of risk in all of that. I'm hoping that the words I'll share with you today, which is mostly about who I am and where I've been in the Episcopal Church, we'll do some history, I'll give you a theological framework that I work with, but I hope that all that I say will actually be a helpful launching pad for our relationship, because these are conversations which I think we'll have for a very long time. We may not have them every day with the same intensity and focus, but by the nature of just who we are together, this will be an ongoing conversation. So I have to note that, because we will probably have moments where we will feel uncomfortable today, all of us. And to name that and move through it is how we continue to have the conversation and not be afraid of it. Charlie spoke a moment ago about veiled conversations, and some of you know that I am passionate about fierce conversations. And that's a trademark name, actually. So I have to be careful about how I use some of that because of the intellectual property issues. But I want to talk to you about, truly, fierce conversations and how this is one of those. A fierce conversation is one where we come out from behind ourselves and make the conversation real, meaning that we're not just at the surface level, but we're daring to get curious below the surface and to actually have conversations that matter, about things that really matter. There's some technical ways that fierce conversations happen, but the premise of it is something that I think is a healthy one for all relationships, particularly those of us in the church who are called to be reconcilers. And that is that we come out from behind ourselves and are fully present to having as authentic a conversation as we can. It's about tackling tough challenges today and not putting them off tomorrow. It's about naming what Fierce calls the moquitas, which is a Papua New Guinea word for the elephant in the room. Mokita sounds a lot nicer, so I kind of like using that word. But Mokita means that which everybody knows, but about which no one speaks. So we're familiar with that dynamic. And so it's also about being willing to see a perspective that's different from our own, knowing that wherever we stand, we can never see the whole picture, and that actually our world is enriched, our lives are enriched when we're able to hear the perspectives from the points that we cannot see from, to see the other and to be curious about it. And it's about hoping to learn something, expecting that in a conversation, particularly one that generates a little heat because there's something at stake about it, that we will actually be learning something new and perhaps changed by it. And that no matter what, in these fierce conversations, the desire is that when we come through it, we have actually enriched the relationship with the person or persons with whom we're having that conversation. The whole point of a fierce conversation is that the relationship is actually strengthened. And so we don't go to these difficult places looking to have division or looking to be one up on someone or looking to induce guilt. We may feel those things individually because we hear words and we experience conversations differently, but the intent is that we enrich the conversation. Final principle I would share with you about that is that a community, a couple, any kind of relationship can be assessed on the kinds of conversations it has. And so if we're together in a relationship and we're having conversations only about the weather or about things that don't actually count for much, or if we have this long list of things that we do not talk about because we fear that it will cause conflict or it'll mess up the weekend or we will just, get in a bad mood about it. If we have a long list of those things that we do not talk about, then our relationships reflect that. They're poorer for it. But if we're having robust conversations about things that matter, about things that actually pull and tug on our hearts a bit, that have some consequence to them, then that actually shows up in how our relationships are. They're more robust, they're stronger, because the relationship becomes about things that matter. So that's the premise from which I'm operating today. So our church, talking about the Episcopal Church, any church, is called to know its story. And the other premise I work from is that calling forth our stories, all of our stories, is an ongoing work that has to be tended to. When all the members of the body contribute to the corporate narrative, we are more whole. Today I want to share some of my own story, as I mentioned, and some history as a way of adding to that. There are many stories out there which will not be told today. I want to name up front that I am speaking as predominantly African-American person with a little bit of Shinnecock Indian, but I present out of the racial experience of being Black in this country. And there are stories that are told and need to be told from the Latina and from the Native American and Asian experience in the Episcopal Church, and we need to draw those forth. And so the fact that I'm not naming those is not because they're not important, but because the story I have to tell and want to share with you is a particular slice of it. So let's start with the word privilege, which is a loaded word these days. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been parts of conversations or have been reading lots of articles which have really come up in the last, 5 or 6 years, particularly around white privilege, right? It's a term we're familiar with. This notion of privilege in general. It's a loaded word. I spoke with a couple of you about the White Privilege Conference. Anybody hear about that? White Privilege Conference? Okay. So the White Privilege Conference, I would Google it. I think it's almost like whiteprivilegeconference.org or something. You might be able to find it. But it's a group of academics, interfaith, that gathers every year, and they talk about white privilege. And they give it sort of an academic emphasis from a multidisciplinary point of view, and It's for lay people who are not in the field as academics, and it's an opportunity to really, again, take away the sort of BuzzFeed type word around white privilege that's kind of up here, and it goes deep with it. So I commend that to you, and if you ever get a chance to go to a conference, you should go. But I want to note that privilege is a relative term, and sometimes we get stuck because we think of it as only one divine set of circumstances. I know that when I think about privilege and Peggy McIntosh's knapsack of privilege, is that a Peggy McIntosh knapsack? Okay, we're going to go through that. Hold on. While I pull that up. So Peggy McIntosh was a professor at Wellesley. I think she's 80-something. I think she's retired now. But she became really known for her work on white privilege back in the late 80s or mid-80s or so. And so I remember carrying this printout that had been Xeroxed over and over again, listing the kinds of things that you might identify as helping to show your privilege wherever you might stand. And so she's a white woman, and she asked, or sort of posed these questions, the daily effects of white privilege. So I'm just going to name some of these, and you can see how you might answer them. I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. When I'm told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. I can be casual about whether or not to listen to another person's voice in a group in which he or she is the only member of his or her race. I can go into a music shop and count on, well, this is probably irrelevant because music shops don't exist anymore. Let me skip that one. Right, this is a little dated. I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them. I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. I can speak in public to a powerful male group without putting my race on trial. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. I am never asked to speak for all of the people of my racial group. So you might be able to see what she's getting at there. And I know when I first worked through this little checklist, there are 21 points to it, I thought, there were a lot that came up for me. And I first encountered this when I was in my 20s. But the way privilege works is that it's relative. And so it's not just color, it's where your color sits with class and status. And so I will say to you that as your bishop-elect, the word privilege as a black woman is something that I'm sort of, it's an interesting flow and dance for me right now because I have a lot of privilege institutionally that I didn't have 20 years ago as a student, say. And yet, I'm still a black woman, and that causes other issues. And so, asking the question of, and looking at privilege is, could be a helpful way to unpack what's happening. Because we all have some privilege. And it's worth we can go through life not ever checking it or looking at it, but it's helpful I think, to look at it. Our privilege, our experience of it can change. But for us as people of God, we find our identity, our privilege, if you will, our still point in God, which is supposed to kind of flatten all of that out. It's supposed to. The biblical and theological concept of the image of God, again, that Charlie referenced, is one that I take as my framework. I'm influenced by the work of the theologian Daniel Migliore, who talked about the Imago Dei in a particular way that allows for the embracing of the diversity of humanity. And so you remember in the creation stories of Genesis, right, first chapter, God completes the work of calming the chaos and creating all living things, and then decides to create humankind. So in the first chapter, you get to verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." To see the diversity of humankind is to understand that the image of God is complex. There have been many interpretations over the centuries of the image of God, the Imago Dei, throughout Christian tradition. But these interpretations have not always been helpful to us in this conversation. You know, to name just a few, we have thought of the image of God as being, or the human reflection of the image of God as being driven in divine physical resemblance, as Charlie noted, or in the capacity to reason, or in the power to exercise dominion over the created order. But a more modern view, the view that Daniel Migliore contends, is that the image of God describes life in relationship. The construction of the image of God is not a set of physical or intellectual attributes, but it is in the realm of transcendence of self in relationship. So to be created in God's image is to be in relationship. God in the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, exhibits perfect relationship and community. And by creating humanity, not as a solitary state, but as an existence from which, from the very beginning, is relational. Remember, male and female, he created them. God establishes that to be created in God's image means to be in relationship. So with that as our premise, to discount a section of humanity is to discount the fullness of God. You begin standing in heretical land right there. To discount any section of humanity is to discount the fullness of God. So without people of color or any of those who are pushed to the margins of society, we lose the complexity of voices that help us know about God. We lose the voices that are longing to share stories that too often go untold. And when the stories go untold, we as a whole church never fully understand who we are. We then have a community that is deprived of its fullness. We cannot be one in Christ. Again, the mission of the church is to restore all people to God and one another through Christ. We cannot be one in Christ if some people are part of the image of God and others are not. Just basic. So that's our struggle, is to know the propensity that humanity has had from the very beginning to divide. And we can sort of, you open up the scriptures and the struggle begins immediately. Us and them, right? The stories that inform our faith. Slaveholder Egyptians, Israelites, slaves, right? The Samaritans. Nobody wants to be a Samaritan, and here comes Jesus holding them up as the ones to whom we should emulate because they are that othered. So this is not, this is humanity. And I think the reason why some of this stuff comes up in our scriptures so often, so foundationally, is because there's something about us that God knows is kind of, maybe, for those of you who are real theologians, that nature of what the fall is about, right? It's really about that brokenness from our relationship to God and to one another. So it comes with being human, and our work always is to be about restoring relationship, reconciling. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about the Episcopal Church. So if I say the name Absalom Jones, everybody know who I'm talking about? Who was he? You shout it out. Who was Absalom Jones? Oh, no, but close. Yes, first African-American priest in the Episcopal Church. And so you might say AME because he was hanging out with Richard Allen, and they went, they parted ways. so we're right in there. So Absalom Jones was ordained deacon in 1795 and priest in 1804. And ever since then, the Episcopal Church, well, on paper, because really, there have been blacks in the Episcopal Church or the Church of England since slaves were coming over, right? So there's a lot of that story that we're only beginning to unearth now. But in terms of what we might call the sort of black experience of the Episcopal Church, it kind of begins with Absalom and creating a congregation, St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, that kind of begins to coalesce the black identity in the church. So the 19th and early 20th century, post-Civil War, was one of great struggle for the Episcopal Church and how it dealt with race issues, or what it called then colored work. And now let me also just say, I'm going to use a lot of terms. People say, well, what do you call black people these days? It's a complicated thing. And it evolves because people have the right to kind of name themselves. And so over time, there have been names given to black people, Negro, colored people, African Americans for those who were born in this country, black, to name the diaspora. And so just know I'm going to be using those terms, and we're not going to get into the politics of it. But the Episcopal Church had to deal with colored work, as they called it, after the Civil War. And now the Episcopal Church will say, we are so proud that after the Civil War, we did not split up. Not like those Methodists or those Lutherans, we stayed together, right? And so, that's true. We stayed together. But it was not without its own difficulties and problems, right? I'm sorry? Well, in the wake of the war, I'm saying. So sort of post-war, the Episcopal Church managed to hold it together, right? We didn't have to reunite in the 60s and 70s because we kind of stayed together. But what we ended up doing was having some real struggles internally about then what do we do with all of these former slaves who are now a part of the community. And so I'm going to take a look at this slice, and I'm going to just hold up this book. Harold Lewis wrote Yet with a Steady Beat. It must be 20-something years ago because I read it when it came out in 1996. Yeah, 20-something years. Yet with a Steady Beat. So I'm going to you should put this on your Kindle or your book list. Harold T. Lewis, who is one of the great historians, priests of our time. I just saw him last month in Washington, D.C. He's an amazing preacher, so you can Google him. But I would read his books because he's done the church a service of chronicling the history of the black church in a way that just hasn't been done. And so I'm going to quote a few things from this book. Lewis, it's Yet with a Steady Beat. Yet with a Steady Beat from Lift Every Voice and Sing, the hymn. He also edited the Lift Every Voice and Sing 2 hymnal. And so he's a musician and priest and historian. So this is the African American struggle for recognition in the Episcopal Church. Harold T. Lewis. And so a snippet, because there's so many ways we could go with this history, and because I'm about to be consecrated a bishop, I wanted to look at the role of bishops. And he writes about that. So if I say the term suffragan bishop, y'all know what I mean? It's one of those Episcopal churchy words. It's an elected bishop to assist the diocesan bishop in the work of the diocese, right? And so if you know the word suffragan, an elected assisting bishop, you might know why that position was created. Anybody have any recollection of why we got suffragan bishops to begin with? For black people. Yeah. Well, yes. Yes. So this is, late 19th, early 20th century. The church is trying to figure out how to minister to black people because you can't be together, really. You can't. That was the thinking. There are all kinds of issues. There were lots of debates that went back and forth over general conventions for decades about how to minister to people who were just, not the same. Natural law. Black people, they've got to sort of come up in the moral and intellectual capacities that God most wants for them, which is not equal to white people, and so they need to be ministered by one of their own. So, let's see. There are a couple of quotes I wanted to share about that because it's kind of stunning. Here's from one of the, and, history is great, and we have all of this in the National Church Archives in Austin. You can just go back and read these General Convention reports. People wonder why you go to General Convention and create all that paper. It's for juicy quotes like this. Very truly. When we have helped the Negro to the achievement of racial self-sufficiency, which is born of accomplishment, to self-mastery, which follows moral victory, and to pride of race, which is only possible when these victories have been gained, we shall have fixed within him the passion for social integrity, which is as justly natural as is that for racial reproduction. Separation of races is greatly misinterpreted if it is not recognized to be the first necessary step towards the achievement of those ends. Separation of races is greatly misinterpreted if it is not recognized to be the first and necessary step towards the achievement of those ends. This is from a majority report about whether we should have a separate missionary district of black people over which we'd have a bishop, or whether you could sort of assume that they'd be okay living where they live with a suffragan elected to serve them in that geographic area. And this went back and forth, and some of the debates are fascinating to read. But what they ended up doing, let's see, I'm sorry, I'm going to find this quote. This was a report out of the General Convention in St. Louis in 1916 from the majority report for actually pushing through the missionary district versus suffragan bishop plan. Now what won out was the suffragan bishop plan. And so that's how we got suffragan bishops. And though they were created to minister to black people, we've only actually had 2 that were meant for that purpose. We now have suffragan bishops everywhere, of all colors, mostly white. But the way it was started was that the first 2 bishops of the Episcopal Church, and these are names that you might know, bishops colored work, Edward Thomas Denby, is that a name you know? Edward Thomas Denby, who was elected in Arkansas to serve the Diocese of Arkansas as for the black people of Arkansas, and also the province of the Southwest, which included any black people in the states of Kansas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Missouri. 1918 is when he was consecrated. So you can imagine what travel would have been like, right? The other bishop ordained that year, consecrated that year, is a name we might know more because of the Delaney sisters, Henry B. Delaney, who was elected in North Carolina. And he, had a shorter tenure, not as successful in many ways. Denby is one that people know because of his long service. He served as a bishop for some 20-something years, and then for another 20 in retirement. He died in the 50s, so he had a very long and impactful life. There would not be a black person elected suffragan bishop in the Episcopal Church in the United States until 1962. And that, another name you may know, John Burgess. Some people may even remember. John Burgess was consecrated in 1962. Now, these places are interesting to me, and so because North Carolina would elect Michael Curry, right? Massachusetts elected Burgess, and who else was elected bishop in Massachusetts? Barbara Harris, the first woman to be consecrated a bishop in the Anglican Communion, who happens to be African American. And then who else did Massachusetts elect? Gail Harris, the second black woman to be elected bishop in the Anglican Communion. That was 2003. So 1918, and then 1962, and then there's a succession of bishops that are ordained between 1962 and 1989, when Barbara Harris was elected, but they were men, and then Gail Harris in 2003. I named those particular places because these places matter. The seeds that are sown out of experience with someone who is other matter. Barbara Harris, she's an incredible, incredible woman, but it's almost no accident that it would be Massachusetts that would be the place that would elect her, right? John Burgess served there for a very long time. And so the idea of a person of color being a suffragan was not a foreign idea. The woman was probably the bigger issue, but the race, because people had seen it. And so I reflect on that for me, because when people say, well, Indiana, how could a black woman get elected in Indiana? Which I'm going to be pondering that for a long time. But, you have done some work over the years. The Episcopal Church in this state has done some work. So it's not new. There's been some familiarity with having women in leadership, which makes a difference. So these things matter. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of history that it's important for us to know, because it is not just the history of the black church, the things I've shared, it is the history of our church. It truly is. Now, that being said, there are difficulties often with being a minority in a predominantly white church, as you might imagine. And you may have heard a few days ago, out of an experience at a press conference, and I think also with Maxine Waters, there was a hashtag that went viral, Black Women at Work. Anybody see that hashtag? Yeah, Black Women at Work, which was black women sharing the experiences of the microaggressions that they live with every day as professionals or just people in the world. And one of the interesting things about having conversations around race and privilege today is that there are things now being said in public forums that have for centuries been private conversations. And maybe social media is helping us with that in a way that I'm hoping will be helpful. But Black Women at Work was an instance where I thought, oh my gosh, people are saying things on Facebook that I have only said at, a small party with women who look like me, right? And so I asked some colleagues of mine about that. I said, what does Black women at church look like? And, it's a hard and sad thing to hear the things that happen today. And so I'll just share a couple of what my experiences might be of that. So I want you to hear this as, again, not something about inducing guilt, but this is what it means for me to live in this role and to live in this country. So I gave a workshop at a forum at the church in Chicagoland where my son had done 5 years of preschool. So I was in and out of that church all the time, and they were wanting to have a conversation on race. It was predominantly white, extraordinarily wealthy church, and they wanted to have the conversation, which I thought was wonderful. So I came in after preaching on Sunday and was walking up to the podium, and a woman a white woman in her 80s, came to the function. So I thought, that's really great. But what she said to me when she greeted me was, I love black people. I love my Dora. She practically raised me. And I didn't know what to say. I just said, well, it's good to meet you, and I stepped forward. Because what do you say, right? When I went to the House of Bishops meeting last month, 4 other black women were congratulated for being elected bishop of the Diocese of Indianapolis. And one of them was the secretary to the presiding bishop. She was a black woman. Another bishop just congratulated her, and she was like, no, well, what do you say? He figured it out later when he got to the house and saw me sitting with the bishops that she was not it, but being confused all the time. And so there are jokes that we make to make it okay for us about that confusion. So Stephanie Spellers has been elected Bishop of Indianapolis. Some of you may know her. We look nothing alike. It's about being seen or not. And that's a thing that sort of wears on one over time. And I get it can go back both ways. But when there are so few of you, it's kind of hard. Here's one I heard recently, happened a few years ago. A black woman priest was was being courted to interview at a church to be an associate rector. This very large, predominantly white church in the South had its associate rector move on to a new position. He was African American. So he left, and they're looking for a new associate. She's African American. And so this staff member called her to say, we would love for you to come and consider being in the search for this job, and we look forward to meeting you and to hearing more about what you might be able to bring to our community. And she hung up the phone and said, well, they don't remember flying me into interview 6 years ago to be an associate, and they did not hire me. They wanted another black person, but they already rejected this one. Stuff like that happens more often than we would care to admit. And so when we wonder about the dynamics of and difficulties around having this conversation, know that there is that reality and lots of pain that goes with it. And what I would hope is that by bringing some of these things to light, that we would all find our way to be able to push through those difficult moments, because some of it is just that, well, you do kind of look like maybe, and or I forget, or I see a black person and I call a name. I get that. I'm going to mess up your names too, right? Y'all don't all look alike. I get that. And yet we need to be able to then say, well, then what next, right? How do we acknowledge what's happened and move towards something that's deeper and more meaningful, or just to name it and to recognize what's happened in that moment. So a little bit about me. It sounds like I'm hopscotching all over the place, but I hope that these will sort of hang together as important things for you. I'm going to read a chapter, a couple of paragraphs from a chapter I wrote 20 years ago, in the late 90s, out of this book, Gathering the Next Generation. It's got a compilation of essays written by Gen Xers, of which I am one. So just some context. Statistics are funny things. They can paint broad strokes of a portrait, and they can be massaged and molded to mean just about anything. They can shed light on a truth or twist reality beyond all recognition. They are very powerful. Two statistics have captured and held my imagination over the past several years. On May 23rd, 1997, the day I graduated from seminary, this is me speaking, an African-American female priest, a mentor of mine, passed on a reality-checking statistic. Out of some 8,000 active clergy in the Episcopal Church, fewer than 30 were African-American women serving in full-time parish ministry. In a few short weeks, I was to become one of them. Almost 1 year later, I would hear the second statistic. According to the Church Pension Fund, out of some 8,000 active clergy in the Episcopal Church, fewer than 300 are 35 and younger. Fewer than 10 of these young clergy are of African descent. I am one of them. These two statistics do indeed paint a few broad strokes on the portrait that is the Episcopal Church, and they shed light on a truth about who we are as opposed to who we would like to say we are. These statistics hold power not just for me as a young black priest of Generation X, but they affect all of us who love and hold claim to the Episcopal Church. It's about looking at the dearth of African American clergy in the Episcopal Church, particularly young ones. I share that with you because it's helpful to know that's the water I stepped into when I was ordained in 1997. And it's hard to keep track of those statistics, but I can assure you that the numbers are really not that much better now. There are very, very few of us. And some would say Harold T. Lewis does a good job of talking about, well, why is that the case? Well, if you look at the history, you can see, and he actually goes into a conversation held with Booker T. Washington way back about why blacks would be in the Episcopal Church. And Harold Lewis, who, if you've known him at all, will recount his generations in the Episcopal Church as a black person, would say, well, why not? Right? And so, but it's certainly dynamics like the ones we've been talking about already make it difficult. And as those of us who are called to do work of reconciliation and continuing to reach out beyond ourselves, it calls us to look at this. Here's another quote I want to share with you from Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. She's a priest in the Episcopal Church, granddaughter of a priest as well. And she was studying the black middle class. And so she writes this, or she wrote this some years back. The losses that accompany privilege are felt more fully by blacks. The losses that accompany privilege are felt more fully by blacks because the predominantly white worlds we enter tend to be so unwelcoming. We strive to arrive at a secure place, only to discover the quicksand of subtle exclusion. We work hard to amass the credentials and signs of status, even as we recognize that our status will never assure a sense of belonging or full membership in the white world. We feel ourselves moving toward the center of power, even as we feel inextricably tied to the periphery. Our outsider status becomes clearer as we work to claim an insider's place. For African Americans, these contradictory experiences of insider-outsider, power, impotence, security, uncertainty, are felt, I think, with particular force. That's a hard dynamic to live with and overcome. There's status, and yet there's always being on the edges of the periphery. Again, to name that and to understand the reality of what that means for people is an important thing for us to hear, because if we don't understand that dynamic at play, we, and by we I mean white folks, can't change it. Right? This is the part of the transformative work that we're called to do. And so for me, I find myself in an interesting situation. I actually had a really great and easy ordination process, as they say. People will look at the outside of my story and say, well, you've just moved right on up in the church. What do you have to complain about? You've not experienced any racism? Well, of course I have, right? And yet, there's been, I think, because of my own background and tackling the race issue since I was 10 years old, I think has enabled me to be more frank and open with this church in this conversation in a way that I pray has, and I pray will continue to be, helpful. But it's an interesting thing that there are so few of us. My desire is not to be a standout, right? I want more of all of the diversity of the church to be reflected in our pews and in our leadership. And so it has come to me not as something, as a conversation I would say when I was little, oh, I can't wait to grow up and be a conversationalist on race and privilege and to be a change agent on all of that stuff. I mean, I wanted to be a librarian and then an architect and all these other things. And yet my work, God has brought me to this work, and I think a part of that is what has brought me to you. And so I wonder about things, those of you who are part of the Episcopal Church who elected me, that, yes, I hope that there were some things that I said that were beyond race, that were about your call for me to be here, and yet I can't help but wonder about whether God is doing something about transforming some stuff around race and privilege in having this election happen. So I hope to be wondering with you about that. Okay, as time is drawing short, I'm going to have some time for questions. So let me just end with this note. Again, it gets to some things I wonder about with you as you were electing, doing the search process for bishop. So the clergy have heard me reflect on this. You have posted in the profile, still online I think, some of the things you were wondering about as a diocese. And there was the quote, something like, we wonder why when we gather at our diocesan convention, we wonder why we are so white. And that, it's one of the many things that hooked me for wanting to actually enter the search process for this particular diocese. Because I thought if they can actually put that in print, on the website, then, well, they're ready to have a conversation that most of the church is just like, I don't want to do that, right? Because you're naming something that's real for you. And you're naming it, and I got to say, because I'm new to this state, but I've lived outside of Indiana all my life until now, and so you just hear things and then read things, right? I mean, I read a book about sundown towns. It was all about Indiana. And I'm going, if they're asking that question in Indiana, well, then let's get this going, because, so I want to know more about that, but I want to back it up a little bit. You're asking the question about why we are so white as an Episcopal Church at convention when you gather. And to me, there are some questions that are worthy of reflection before you get there. Like, why do our congregations look the way they do? Particularly if there are opportunities for them to be more diverse because there are people around us. What is it about the way we worship or the music we play and share that is just one slice of Anglican history and liturgy that doesn't allow for the other to find a place in it? I would ask the question, and let me just assure you, people of color do ask these questions, and I'm asking those of you who present as white to ask these questions. What do my friendship circles look like? Who do I spend most of my time with? Are they people who look mostly like me? Am I not taking opportunities to expand that circle? And making friends is hard and all that, but just to wonder about that. Because where we spend our time will influence who we get to invite to church, and that influences who actually comes to church, and there it goes. And so this work, the question is kind of at an institutional level, and we need to bring it back down. Because there is some individual personal work that we're called to do. And we're called to do it because, not because it's the sort of, I'm not going to use the word PC, but it's not because it's like a feel-good thing to do to be as diverse as we ought to be. It's because it is the work of the gospel. We are about reconciling. We are about fulfilling God's desire that we truly reflect as much as we can the fullness of God. And that we do not pretend that others out there are not called to be with us. Or that they might not get us, or we won't even try. We're actually called to be changed by interacting with people who are different from us on a daily basis. And to sit with that and to be expanded by it, with all the challenges that come with being in relationships of difference. God is calling us to wrestle with these things also because it is, and it's not about navel gazing, but because it's gospel work. There is real work for us to do, not for people who are different from us by race or class, but with people who are different from us by race or class, wherever we sit in the sort of categories. I think about the things I read around the news. People, I can go on, but I'm reading about sort of mass incarceration and drugs, right? Something that black folks have been up in arms about for decades. And now it's a big conversation because poor black men without an education are dying of drugs. Poor white men without a college education are dying of drugs. People are dying. And we need to figure that out. And we can't do it, I think, in the most transformative way if we're not about that work together. Because we know some things, and out of our experience, that can help us find some solutions to improving this world. And if we're segregated in those conversations, and if we're segregated in how we treat those experiences, we're not doing it the way I think God calls us to do. Part of doing this work is calling us to be more like Jesus, crossing over the boundaries, looking at the other, recognizing that in some way each of us is the other, and saying that that is not just about where we stand today, but it's about how we take whatever privilege and position we may have, and if we're in this room, we have some, all of us, right? If we're in this room, we've got some power and privilege no matter what color or class we are. It's just the way it is. So then what do? How do we give it away? How do we use our position and our privilege to give away our power so that we might transform the world, to undo the systems of injustice and oppression? Because until we are about that work together, we will not be well. We will not be well. We will not be whole. This is the hard work of moving towards reconciliation. It is not going to be something that we will solve in our lifetime. We will feel that progress does not come fast enough. But remember, this stuff goes back since the creation of humanity. So perhaps our goal is never to solve it, but to be about continually transforming it, so that we might make those steps to which God calls us to actually moving towards unity. For those who are here, for their health, for their well-being, for the sake of our very souls. We will not truly reflect the Imago Dei until we do that work. The image of God is all of us, in all of its diverse that the break time? So, okay, great, so we have, okay. How would you like to handle that? Should I field them from here, or? Great. So, this is the one, or do you have another one?
You use that one.
Okay, great.
Plugged in. We are recording this, by the way. So,
Our world is becoming more and more segregated. We have a great increase in use of school vouchers here in Indiana. So public school private schools are even more segregated than public schools. My last career before I moved here was selling real estate in Westchester County in New York. And people were incredibly liberal and incredibly determined to live in their communities that look just like them. And so how do we as a church, given that we're trying to go this way, but it seems like society is going this way?
So, segregation is something, you're right, it's not the law of the land, and yet it is the way of the land these days. And, we have this tension of wanting to do what's best for the world, while at the same time wanting what's best for our own families and ourselves. And I think it's when we move into a mode of saying, well, it's really only about me, that sort of gets us into where we are now. And so, vouchers, which I'm learning about how that works in this particular state, but we can see some of the things that are coming nationally, some of the legislation which is on the books. I think the church is called to help the world, and to speak to that, to help the world see that it is not just about me, myself, and I. And we are in a very individualistic society, and it's really hard to do that, but we have been silent on that. I know we're getting more involved individually, perhaps in the sort of politics of the country on some of these education issues. But one of the most important things I think we can do is to actually speak to it and actually make different choices. So in Chicago, in my office, we would speak almost every lunch period about education, because we had all of these white families who chose to stay in Chicago and to have their kids in public schools, and what the tensions and frustrations were to do that. But they saw it not just as sort of a good thing to do, but as their Christian responsibility as white people to stay in the city, when it would be really easy to do what most people do in Chicagoland, and perhaps here, is that, well, you're in the city till your kids turn about 4, and then you find the closest suburb that you can afford to actually have that experience, which then has all kinds of economic and racial implications. We're actually called to speak about making different choices, and making them not for the sake just of ourselves, but for the common good. That's one of the particular problems we find ourselves in now, is that the notion of what is the common good, the funding of the common good, the making legislation for the sake of the common good and not individual and corporate profit has become the way of the land. And we need to be actually naming that and working in our individual ways to change that system from a systemic point of view. So again, no answers, but that, I hope, describes some of the work I think we're called to.
Just a quick question.
You said you became an activist at 10, and I'd like to know what caused it.
I was born in Staten Island, quickly moved to Brooklyn, lived in Brooklyn, loved it. Very racially mixed community, black, white, Puerto Rican, and I'm 10, so it's all the nirvana, right? And then my parents moved us back to Staten Island to be closer to family. And walking home from, so I was about 11, when I walked home from 6th grade, 6 blocks, someone spit at me, a white person, and called me the N-word. And I didn't, and I was 11 and had to deal with that. The next thing that happened was my crush on a 7th grader named Peter, who was Italian. and are having to take buses to the far side of Staten Island to actually have a study date together because people didn't want a black girl to be with a white boy. And having some consciousness about that and having to deal with that at that age informed the rest of my life profoundly. Yes, Charlie, you're up here.
I have been concerned, worried, curious for a very long time about why there are so few, and I may be wrong about this, so few African Americans in this whole church. In my experience, I know 4 African Americans in Alcoholics Anonymous. Why aren't there more? I don't understand this, and I don't know what to do about it, honestly.
So that's another forum. It's a complicated question, but some of it has to do with welcome. It has to do with culture, I think. You know, I mean, here, just by way of example, Black church on the south side of Chicago. Stephanie Spellers, not me. I was with her, so we could not be confused together in the same room. She's doing her Radical Welcome workshop. She does these across the country. She wrote the book on how to be welcoming, truly hospitable to people who are different. And in this Black church, a Black woman said, well, you know, we don't want these Black people out here because they'll be loud and clap a lot, right? Because it was a class difference, right? So it gets complicated because the Episcopal Church is not only bucking what it means to be a Black person in a church that was initially hostile and sometimes actively hostile, and also to be a church that has said, well, you know, we do this and we don't do that, right? We do high Anglican chant and we do not do music that's going to have a beat to it, which culturally is a thing for Black folks, right? And so some churches have said, well, actually we do that, and we do it in the Black Episcopal Church tradition only, and some churches of mixed makeup actually has a broad English musical tradition, but that's one way where even if we invited people, folks who are not raised on the sort of European English music set, but have a hard time entering it. And if we say, well, this is the only way we do it, and you gotta hold a book. 2 books. You know what I mean? I mean, so there's some real cultural things. And so part of what being open to diversity means for Black folks, many who are on a spectrum of class experience, means that we actually have to be willing to do things differently. And we don't like to do things differently in the Episcopal Church. There are jokes about that. And when it comes to race and culture, it's a problem for us. So it's a complicated question and answer, but that's a piece of it. When I invite Black people who don't know anything about the church, who may have been raised in another Christian tradition, and they come to the Episcopal Church, there'll be one of 2 general reactions. One might be, oh, this is so solemn and lovely and sensual, and I love this. And others will be like, what was that? Really? And so we have to name that and to say, well, okay, what does it look like for us to change the way we worship, which is a cultural thing because the Episcopal Church has a culture, right? And it's informed a particular way. So that's some of it. There are other issues. There's segregation. There's neighborhoods that we had lots more Black churches in the Episcopal Church, but we said we can't stay in the inner city. It's getting really dangerous, and people are, so we're moving to the suburbs, or we're going to close that church because it's struggling because people of color, for lots of reasons you might know about, don't have enough money to support that congregation. So we're going to let that go. Everybody for themselves. We're not going to see that as a targeted mission strategy to stay in these places where people of color of all kinds might want an Episcopal experience, but no, because we're not going to do that. We won't think about the history that has led us to the point where communities look the way they do. And so, I can go on, but that's some of the stuff. It's a big thing. So how do we move forward from here is my question. Like, how do we say, okay, that's the history. Then now who do we want to be now? are there ways in which we might reach out in Bloomington or wherever you happen to be, where there are people who can broaden our sense of who we are? It may not just be about Black people. Maybe it's Asian people. Maybe it's Latinos. Maybe it's someone who is maybe it's blue collar folks. Maybe because that's a thing in our church. The class issue is probably more potent and difficult for us than the race one, because the class piece runs all through it, as in that first example about a Black community that could not move beyond its own class understanding to be welcoming to people who look like them but who have nothing in common with their race.
Do we have time for another question? If so, we have one back here.
Okay, we can talk at the break.
I just wanted to ask, would you be taking this sort of dialogue to other churches, either here within the diocese or wherever you're invited to bring this sort of dialogue? Because I think the one-time meeting is wonderful, but boy, we need more conversation.
Well, as I mentioned, I think that there'll be ways in which this conversation, I hope, will be carried on and evolving in ways that are good for the whole community. Here's my situation right now. Honestly, I'm an African-American diocesan bishop to be, and I don't want to talk about race and privilege every single day, right? So I just got to name that, because that could be like, this is what I do, right? There's lots of other things I like to talk about and that I am about and that we are about, and yet the conversation needs to be sustained. And so my invitation to all of you is to find ways to continue this conversation in a couple of ways. As predominantly white folks, like without people of color in the room, you need to have some conversations about this, and then to think about how do you sustain this conversation where you are. I think part of the role of diocesan leadership is to help jumpstart that, and this is kind of an opportunity to do that. But then to think, well, what does this conversation look like as I continue it with people? Is there a person who's different from me who I trust enough to say, look, this is a thing, help me, let's have a different conversation about race and class, and I know it's going to be sticky and messy, but let's be fierce, meaning let's have the conversation that is the Makita that will help us to enrich our relationship for the sake of this relationship and for the sake of the world. I think that's our time, though, but thank you so much, and I look forward to talking with you more.